hand him over to the Gentiles. They'll mock him, spit on him, scourge him, and kill him. 3 days later he will rise again. Are all those conditional statements?
They would be conditional at this point unless, and has happened in Jonah's case, God could intervene. God could step in and do something different, but we know in retrospect that the Father isn't going to do that. He doesn't do that.
Okay. You said also in your book, you noted the words of Luke in reference to the crucifixion of Christ, such as Acts 2:23, 4:27-28, in which it is said that Herod and Pontius Pilate and the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel did whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur. You indicate on page 103 that the rejection of the Jews, quote, did not catch God off guard, however, for he anticipated their response and so walked onto the scene with an excellent prognosis of what would happen. You then state, quote, the crucifixion could not have occurred to Jesus unless somehow it fit into the boundaries of what God willed, end quote. Is it your position that the words, to do whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur, refers merely to God having an excellent prognosis of what men would do?
Well, I think that God has a plan, and He's working towards it. But as much as possible, I try to interpret the text such that God is working through the freedom of these human beings and what they are, their reaction to Jesus claiming to be who He is, and what they, their plans, their desires are in terms of that. So I believe that God is, in a sense, dependent here upon these guys following through on their course of action, which is pretty good bet because of who they are.
When God created, did He know at the time of creation that someone named Pontius Pilate would exist as a fact of knowledge, or was it only a possibility?
Yeah, I would say God knew that as a possibility, not as an actuality.
Okay, all right. Psalm 139:4 says, even before there is a word on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it all. In your book on page 130, you say that God may be predicting what the psalmist will say. Is it your position that it is a consistent exegetical reading of the purpose and meaning of the psalmist to understand him to be saying, as I understand what you're saying, God can predict what I will say to a high degree of probability? Mm-hmm. Is that how you understand the concept of prediction, especially with something as utterly unpredictable as the speech of man?
Mm-hmm. Well, given that God's knowledge of our characters, our vocabularies, that David doesn't suddenly break into Chinese, I think God is going to know that. In terms of God knowing what we are going to say, I find it interesting that, again, there are various texts that people such as Bruce Ware tend to ignore in the Old Testament, where God is portrayed as not knowing what someone was going to say. So again, I think there are...
Such as? Could you give me an example?
Here, I got to remember.
That's if you
with the testing of people. Let's see. I'm trying to remember the name of the paper. Michael Karasik has a paper on this in the Journal of Biblical Literature.
Okay. All right. Psalm 139:16 says, your eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in your book were all written the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them. Since it seems to me anyways, a self-evident fact that the length of our lives, our days, is determined, at least from our standpoint, by a myriad of libertarian free will choices. For example, a lot of my friends are unhappy about the fact that I have recently obtained a Virago 1100 Yamaha motorcycle, and hence they figure my free will choice is probably going to limit the number of my days. Since the length of our days would seem to be the result of a myriad from the open theistic perspective, libertarian free will choices, which are, as I understand it, unknowable to God upon those grounds. How could the psalmist say what he said in Psalm 139:16?
Yeah. I don't have Greg Boyd's book, God of the Possible, here, but he addresses that. And
yes, he does.
It seems to me, if I recall correctly what he says, that much depends upon how one translates the Hebrew text here, and exactly what is it that is ordained.
Have you looked at Dr. Ware's rather, I think, devastating demonstration that the Hebrew is very, very clear, and that the King James translation that Dr. Boyd depends upon is clearly in error? Have you looked at what he says about that in his book?
I have. And I'm sure I have comments written in the margins, but I don't know what they are.
Okay. All right. So you would say that your response to verse 16 then would be to adopt the King James rendering of the text of the Hebrew, and that God therefore does not know the length of my days or your days?
Right, unless God has determined them.
Unless God has... How could God determine, based upon the idea that libertarian choices are unknown to God, given that the length of my life is the result of innumerable such choices? How could God determine the length of my life without violating my...
Well, that's what I said, unless God determined it. That's what it would amount to, right?
Can you give me an example where God has determined that and hence violated people's free will? Are you familiar with any?
None specifics come to mind. I'm saying that God could do that, but I don't think God typically does that.
So would this be a rare situation?
In my opinion, yes.
Okay, so then from the open theistic perspective, for the vast majority of Christian believers, the day of our death is unknown to God.
Yes.
Okay.
He knows the possibilities. He doesn't know the actualities.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. I'm just wondering, how would you define omniscience? What would you give as a definition of that?
I think a biblical definition of omniscience is certainly commensurate with what Westminster Confession of Faith talked about, and both in regards to God's decree and all having knowledge of all possibilities, but specifically full, exhaustive knowledge of not only all things past, present, and future in regards to human actions,